Hello and welcome back to a little bit of a myth. Group B was the craziest, maddest, fastest rally the world had ever seen, and some would say is still the craziest, maddest rally the world has ever seen. And it led to some interesting beliefs or misconceptions. The biggest one, and the one that we're looking at today, came in 1986 with Henry Toivonen and his Lancia Delta S4. You see, Toivonen was at the Estoril Formula 1 circuit in Portugal for some F1 testing. And somewhere, somehow, the story was twisted so that the rumor was that Toivonen lapped the Estoril Formula 1 circuit so fast in his Lancia Delta that he would have scored 6th on the grid for qualifying. Now that caught my attention, and I thought, we actually have Group B cars in Forza Motorsport 7, and we have Formula 1 cars. So I thought of putting a bunch of rally cars against a Formula 1 car to see how true this story really is. Now, we do not have the Peugeot 205, the T16. We have the road version, we don't have the rally version. Which is a bit of a shame, because the 205 is the most successful Group B car of all time. We do have the Audi Quattro S1E2, and the Lancia Delta S4, which is great, because that's what this story really revolves about. All we needed now was a rival and a track. Now, if you take this Ferrari 641 around pretty much any track that has a mix of straightaways and corners, it will absolutely annihilate any rally car, annihilate any car but another Formula 1 racer. But what if you go to a more technical track? What if you go to one where there's virtually no straightaways, you never get above 150, which means, 1, you don't have the maximum usage of your downforce, and 2, rear-wheel drive Formula 1 cars will struggle to put their power out of the corners, something that a rally car will not necessarily have. So are we rigging this challenge in the rally car's favor? Yes. Do I really care because we're still trying to do the seemingly impossible here? No. So I set a benchmark time around a soggy, wet Virginia International Raceway in the 641, and that time was a 41.647. Now that's a pretty tough benchmark. I mean, the Ferrari is an X-Class, but as you can see, it's not exactly easily controllable. The speeds are incredibly high, especially on the nearly flat-out chicane, and the slow-speed corners do cause the 680 horsepower to escape very rapidly. So it is not an easy car to drive, and that's what we were banking on. Whether or not these rally cars could use that acceleration out of the corners to make up for the lack of sheer downforce. Now, I didn't want to limit this to just Group B cars, because there are a few other rally series in Forza besides these Group B monsters, one of them being the Group NR4, something like that. Rally cars for the North American Championship. In this case, the Subaru WRX VT15R. Yes, that is the name for a rally car, apparently. And this was a bit of a stretch, let's be real. It's only got 330 horsepower, it has half the horsepower of the Ferrari, it weighs almost 3,000 pounds, and while yes, it is all-wheel drive and much more modern, it is a bit underpowered, and the acceleration definitely does not offset the handling. It has a lot of aero, which is good. It actually has usable aerodynamics from the factory. It just doesn't have the pace, because this Formula 1 car, funnily enough, has more aero, less weight, and while sure, it doesn't have the same power out of the corners, it also has more power out of the corners in the fact that it has simply more power. So while sure you're only at 50% throttle, that's still about the same as the Subaru, and the minute you get traction, you're at 100% throttle, and then you're gone. So the Subaru was at a 50.982, which is actually not bad. I know it's quite a short circuit, being in the 50-second range, but being only 9 seconds down on a Formula 1 car, this is A-Class, and this is an X-Class Ferrari. I'm pleased with the little Subaru, okay? It's punching well above its weight. It's just in 10 seconds of a Ferrari Formula 1 car, despite being, what, 500 near enough PI down, and half the horsepower and almost double the weight. That is some truly impressive machinery for a relatively mild rally car, at least what's to come. Well, it's not exactly gonna beat any records. I think the Subaru did not too terribly at all. The same cannot be said for the Ford Focus RS RX Rallycross car. This is pretty much a modern-day Group B car, only instead of on rally stages, it's on rallycross circuits, which means it's perfectly fine to race. It's a monster. 600 horsepower, all-wheel drive, and more aerodynamics than a GT3 racer. Pretty good, right? Not a bad formula. However, it doesn't have the turn-in. Rallycross cars drift around, they slide around, that's how they get speed, so their setups are designed for sliding around on dirt. But that's not how you get speed, A, on Forza, and B, on a circuit race like this. That's just not how the grip works. Which means this car gets horrible understeer. It's still on its rallycross tires, its rallycross suspension, it's completely bone stock, just like the Subaru. Was honestly disappointing. It's 2 seconds faster than the Subaru, which I hope so. It's an R class, so it's only 2 classes below the Ferrari. But it just isn't fast. I was expecting a lot more, I'll be honest. I was expecting a lot more. It's also a Gymkhana car, so that might also not help. But I don't think they did anything funky to it for the Gymkhana setup. Either way, you turn to a corner, and there's just nothing. There's just no front end grip. And then you hit the gas, and all that grip disappeared, and you just start sliding. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to drive. And while the aerodynamics are helpful, just like the Ferrari, they're not as useful because you're simply not going fast enough. Only this time, unlike the Ferrari, which had an immense amount of mechanical grip, this thing does not. At all. Yeah, I was very disappointed with this car because this is really what rallycross cars are all about. Very technical, very short circuits. And while sure, 7.3 seconds slower than a Formula 1 car is not bad at all, I was expecting it to be closer, especially when we look at the up-and-coming Group B cars. Because the Lancia, the S4, is a second faster than it, near enough exactly, a 47.34. And it's weird. I don't understand why. It has smaller tires, it has older tires, older suspension, less aerodynamics, and the exact same amount of horsepower. Just slightly less than 600. I don't understand. Maybe it's the setup, because this thing is a turbocharged and supercharged car, so it might have a better power band, which means it has better acceleration? I'm not sure. Either way, it was a second faster. And we are now actually within 6 seconds of that Ferrari, which is incredible for a stock rally car. This is still on 1980s suspension, 1980s tires. The aerodynamics were in their infancy. The only thing this thing has is no weight, 2,000 pounds, and a colossal amount of horsepower. It was faster than a modern-day rallycross car. I think that just goes to show how fast these Group B cars are, even in their stock guise. What was really difficult about the Lancia was that it wanted to oversteer a lot, and you actually got speed out of oversteering. I know I mentioned that drifting in the Focus was slower, and it is, but there's a certain amount of drifting that actually is faster with these cars. Because they don't have any turn-in, you do have to kick the back end out just a little bit to get the turn-in that required. So you do need an element of sideways, but it's not so much a drift, because everyone knows that drifting is substantially slower. It's more of a four-wheel skid, sort of like the old Formula 1 cars or the Caterhams. It was really difficult to ring this car, but what's nice is that since it had that understeer followed by oversteer, you got understeer in the first section, you hit the power a little bit harder than you normally would, you kick the back end out, which then turns the front end a little more, you manage to throttle, and you basically slide your way around the corner in a straight line. Which means you get a better exit, which means you carry the RPMs, and you carry the speed. And that is how you get speed. It is a really tricky thing to get right. But once you do get it right, you can get a very clean, very fast exit. And that is what you want, to get the maximum acceleration you can out of these cars. That all being said, the Lancia was not the winner in this, which is bizarre. The winner was the Audi, the Quattro. I didn't expect that, because the Delta, in real life, is significantly faster than the Quattro. It's easy to see why. It's mid-engine versus front engine. It weighs 200 pounds less, and while sure it doesn't make as much horsepower, it's still 550 horsepower to the Audi Quattro 600. So, the power to weight is not that different, but it has a mid-engine layout versus the Audi's front engine. Regardless, the Audi was faster, by a tenth of a second, but it was faster. And because it was so close, I'm going to say the key difference between these cars is the massive snowplow effect. You heard of the snowball effect? This is the snowplow effect, where the bigger the front diffuser and front aero is, the faster your car will go, which means the Quattro is unstoppable, apparently. The snowplow and the body kit and the aero is comical. I love this thing. It's by far my favorite of the Group B cars just because of the crazy visuals on it, and actually, it is really nice to drive. That's another thing, it's very nice to drive. It's much nicer to drive than the Lancia. Maybe because it's a little bit heavier, and it's pushing itself around the corners a little more controllably, but it was not as twitchy, it was not as oversteery, and it had a much smoother power delivery, at least to me, than the Lancia, which is weird because this is a single turbo 5-cylinder versus a twin-charged 4-cylinder, but whatever. The Quattro was fast. It was the fastest car that I ever got. And it's still within 6.2 seconds of the Ferrari, so nothing stock could beat the Ferrari. Which comes to the next phase. Could anything at all from a rally car beat that Ferrari? I decided to start with the Focus, the RS RX, because I just couldn't accept that a car that modern with that much power and that much acceleration and handling could be so much slower than a car from the 80s. So I thought if I fixed the understeer problem, it might give me an advantage and it might significantly cut the time down, and it did. It went from a 48.3 to a 46.2. That is a 2-second decrease in time. But it's still not enough. It's within 5 seconds of the Ferrari, which is good. That's very good. But it's not enough. And once again, it's because of the understeer. No matter what I did, I put it on race tires, I gave it 780 horsepower, I maxed out the aero, I changed the differential, I did all that stuff. And it still got understeer. I still couldn't feel like I was carrying the speed that I should be. Certainly enough speed to get within range of the Ferrari. And that was its biggest problem. No matter what I did, no matter what sideways action I tried, no matter what tuning setup I tried, I could never get it to get that front end turned enough that I wanted it to be. Which is a shame, because I like the Focus RS. It's a really fun rallycross car. But it's just not fast enough. I mean, 5 seconds is not bad, and it is the fastest car we've had at this point, but it's not quite there. Which is why I went back to the Audi. The fastest car would get the fastest upgrades. This thing is insane. It is in P class. Not R class, P class. Low P class, but still P-Class. And it has 800 horsepower, racing slicks, massive tires, better brakes, and of course the hill climb body kit to try and get as much downforce around these corners as possible. This is basically hill climb spec, because Pikes Peak was about 800 horsepower, I think, for the S1E2, something like that. And this is pretty much that car. And it was absurdly fast. But also, it was actually, again, relatively easy to drive. I thought with the power and the weight reduction and all that stuff, it would be more difficult, and it was slightly more difficult, but nowhere near as bad as I thought. Especially considering how much power and how old this car is, it handled it very well. And I was pleasantly surprised by it, which means it did a 45.7. That is within 4 seconds of a Formula 1 car. 4 seconds. That's absurd. Again, this is still 1980 suspension. I couldn't change the suspension. I tried to make it as good as I could, but I couldn't change it that much. And the aero is still 1980s hill climb aero. So it's very old-fashioned. And yet, it was within 4 seconds of a Formula 1 car. So, nothing was actually able to beat the Ferrari 641. And that's kind of what I expected when I set out with this challenge. Because, yes, these are very quick cars, and the Quattro actually had more power than it. In fact, both the Focus and the Quattro had more than 100 horsepower more. But they just don't have the lightweight and the mechanical grip. That is when they lack the most. That turn-in and that acceleration once they get the power down. That's what the Ferrari has that those cars can never dream of. That mid-speed corner acceleration. Which is a shame, because I really wanted a underdog victory in this regard. They're actual rally cars. They're not Formula 1, they're not GT cars, they're not Group C Le Mans, they're rally cars. Going up against a Formula 1 racer. And to be honest, sure, they only got within 4 seconds, but you need to keep this in mind. The original myth was that the Lancia came within 6th place on the grid. And that means they're battling with the mid-range teams that were significantly slower than the dominant Ferraris and McLarens at the time. So while sure, these rally cars are not as fast as the fastest Ferrari of the year, they are within 4 seconds, and that means that would probably put them ahead of a lot of teams. Teams like Arrows or USAF. Stuff like that would actually get beaten, I would imagine, by a Lancia or by an Audi if they were in this game. If we actually raced an Arrows F1 car or another, C- team that was in the bottom 10, they might actually beat them. And I think that's the craziest thing about this, because the Ferrari is newer than these cars. It's 1990. That's the fastest car. I think it was the second fastest car on the entire grid. And they came within 4 seconds of that. And we're talking about just trying to get 6th place. So, while sure none of them beat the Ferrari, if we had a more mid-range team, they might be able to hold them at bay, if not overtake them for position on this track. That is something that's truly incredible, and I think highlights the speed of these rally cars and makes me respect them even more. But that will be it for this episode of Forza Motorsport 7. I'll be back with more.